James Carter sat at his kitchen table, the kind of table that had seen more bills than breakfasts, and let me tell you, this morning wasn't shaping up to be any better. The sunlight crawled reluctantly through the blinds, casting long shadows over a stack of paperwork that looked more like a monument to frustration than anything useful. At 42 years old, James was supposed to be one of those men who had made it. You know, the type who walks into a room and people sit up a little straighter, not because they want to, but because they have to. But life? Oh, life doesn't give a damn about your plans, your titles, or how hard you've worked. It's got this nasty habit of tossing bricks at your face just when you think you've got it all figured out. James stared at the pile of papers in front of him, each one taunting him with its fine print and bureaucratic nonsense. It wasn't that he couldn't understand it. He could probably recite the contents of a financial statement in his sleep. But today it all felt heavier, more personal. Maybe it was the stress of running a massive company. Maybe it was the nagging thought that no matter how high he climbed, the world always found a way to remind him of where he came from. And where was that, you ask? South Side Chicago, baby. The kind of place where dreams either grow teeth or get eaten alive. James wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Hell, there wasn't even a plastic one. His father worked double shifts at a steel mill until the day he was fired for daring to speak up about unsafe working conditions. "You've got to be 10 times better than them," his father used to say, the words seared into James's brain like a brand. Not twice, 10 times. Because they'll never let you forget who you are. James had taken that advice to heart. He'd clawed his way out of that neighborhood, through scholarships, internships, and endless late nights. He built himself into a man that people couldn't ignore. And yet, here he was, 20 years later, staring at a stack of papers like it was some cruel reminder that no matter how far you go, the world has a way of dragging you back down. But James wasn't about to let that happen. Not today. Today he had a plan. You see, James had this little habit. Every now and then, he liked to go undercover. No suits, no ties, no chauffeur waiting in the car. Just James, in a beat-up leather jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. It was his way of staying grounded, of seeing the world the way most people did, unvarnished and raw. And today he'd decided to visit one of the branches of his own bank. Not for a big meeting, not to shake hands and make speeches, but just to see how things really ran when nobody knew who he was. He'd picked a branch downtown, the kind of place that looked polished on the outside, but had a reputation for treating its customers less than fairly. James had heard whispers, complaints about long wait times, dismissive staff, and in more than one case, outright discrimination. It wasn't something he could ignore. He grabbed his wallet, his keys, and a baseball cap that had seen better days and headed out the door. He wasn't expecting much. A few raised eyebrows, maybe a little impatience from the staff. But what he walked into, that was a whole different story. When James stepped into the bank, the air hit him like a wall. You know that feeling? The one where you walk into a room and suddenly everyone pretends you don't exist? Yeah, it was that. The space was sleek, all marble floors and shiny counters, but it felt colder than a morgue. A few customers were scattered around, waiting in line or filling out forms. The staff, mostly white, barely glanced up as he entered. James made his way to the counter, keeping his head low. He wasn't there to cause a scene, just to observe. The guy behind the counter, mid-30s, with a face that screamed, "I peaked in high school," gave him a once-over that lasted just a little too long. His name tag read Mike, and James could already tell he was going to be a problem. "Can I help you?" Mike asked, in the tone of someone who clearly didn't want to. "Yes," James replied evenly. "I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my account." Mike raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly like James had just asked to borrow his car. "Do you have ID?" James pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license along with his bank card. Mike took them with a deliberate slowness that made James's teeth clench. "What's the account number?" Mike asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. James gave it to him. Mike typed it into the computer, his fingers moving like molasses. After what felt like an eternity, he frowned. "Yeah, we can't do that," Mike said, sliding the cards back across the counter. James blinked. "Excuse me?" "We don't have that kind of cash on hand," Mike said, shrugging. "You'd need to put in a request, and even then we'd have to verify certain things." "Certain things?" James repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Like what?" Mike smirked, the kind of smirk that made you want to punch someone in the teeth. "Like whether the funds are legitimate." For a moment, James just stared at him, the words hanging in the air like a bad smell. Legitimate. That one word hit him harder than any insult ever could. He felt the weight of every barrier he'd ever had to break through, every indignity he'd swallowed just to get to where he was. And here he was again being treated like a criminal for daring to exist. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let this guy see how much he'd gotten under his skin. Not yet. "Well," James said, leaning slightly closer to the counter, "how about you check again?" Mike sighed dramatically, like James was asking him to perform brain surgery. "Look, sir," he said, dragging out the last word like it was an insult. "Even if we had the cash, which we don't, you'd need to provide additional documentation. To prove you're not, James's jaw tightened. "No," he said slowly. "I don't know. Why don't you explain it to me?" Mike hesitated, but just for a second. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's just say we have policies. Gotta make sure everything checks out. You understand?" James understood perfectly, and in that moment, he made a decision. This wasn't going to end here. James stood there, his patience hanging by a thread thinner than the smirk on Mike's face. The guy had the kind of attitude that made you wonder how he hadn't been punched yet. Mike's last remark, laced with thinly veiled suspicion, echoed in James's head. "We have policies. You understand?" Yeah, James understood all right. Understood that he was about to lose his cool. "I asked for my money, not an interrogation," James said, his tone sharper now. A few customers glanced over, sensing the shift. But Mike? Oh no, he wasn't done. The guy leaned back against his chair, folding his arms like he was about to deliver a lecture. "Look," Mike began, his voice dripping with fake patience. "It's not personal. We just need to make sure everything checks out. Some people, they try to game the system." James let that hang in the air for a moment. His jaw clenched. The rage bubbling inside him wasn't new. It was the same old anger he'd carried since the South Side, the kind that came from being constantly underestimated. And now, here he was again being treated like he didn't belong. "Let me get this straight," James said, leaning forward just enough to make Mike flinch. "You're accusing me of trying to steal my own money?" Mike shrugged, the smirk returning. "Hey, I didn't say that, but people like..." James cut him off, his voice now low and icy. "People like me?" "Go on, finish the sentence." Mike hesitated, clearly realizing he'd stepped into dangerous territory. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "All I'm saying is we've got rules, and people like you don't always fit the profile." The room went silent. A middle-aged woman in line gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest like she'd just witnessed a car crash. Another customer, a younger guy, muttered, "Damn, dude," under his breath. James could feel the weight of their stares, but he wasn't here for their sympathy. He was here for a point and for his money. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to smile. "All right, Mike," he said, his voice calm but lethal. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to process my withdrawal. Right now. Or I'll make a call and we'll see how your policies hold up when corporate gets involved." Mike's face twitched. For a split second, the smug confidence wavered, but then, as if deciding to die on this hill, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Call whoever you want," he sneered. "But I don't care if you have the Pope's phone number. Without the right documentation, you're not getting a cent." James blinked, stunned by the sheer audacity. Then he laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that made Mike sit back in his chair. "Okay," James said, straightening up. "You've made your point. Let's see how far this goes." He pulled out his phone, ignoring the curious glances from the growing crowd of customers. As his fingers flew across the screen, Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You really calling someone?" Mike asked, his voice suddenly less sure. "Oh, I'm calling," James replied, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "But don't worry, it's not the Pope." The tension in the room thickened as James waited for the line to connect. This was no longer about $5,000. This was about something much bigger, though Mike had no idea just how big. The phone rang once, twice, and then picked up. James didn't waste a second. "Get me the regional manager," he said into the receiver, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Mike's smirk faltered as he watched James speak, the realization creeping in that this wasn't just some random guy looking for a fight. James paced slowly, his tone calm but laced with the kind of authority that made people listen. The other customers in the bank were now openly watching. Whispered conversations filled the air. "Who is this guy? He's not messing around. Did you hear how he said manager? Like he owns the place." Mike, meanwhile, was sweating through his button-up shirt. He glanced nervously at his coworkers, but they were no help. None of them dared intervene. One woman, clearly uncomfortable, muttered something about taking a break and disappeared into the back room. James ended the call, his expression unreadable. He slid his phone into his pocket and turned back to Mike. "Now," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. "You're going to check my account again. And this time, you're going to do it properly." Mike's hands hovered over the keyboard, his arrogance replaced by visible unease. He typed in the account number again, his fingers trembling just enough for James to notice. The screen lit up and Mike's eyes flickered with something close to panic. Sir?" he stammered. "There seems to be a note on your account. I just need to check with—" "Spare me the excuses," James interrupted. "Just tell me what it says." Mike hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. It says to refer any large withdrawals to upper management." The room went silent. James raised an eyebrow, a slow smirk forming on his lips. "Interesting," he said, crossing his arms. "And yet you thought it was appropriate to deny me service without even bothering to follow protocol?" Mike didn't respond. He looked like he wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. "That's what I thought," James said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But don't worry, I'm sure this little misunderstanding can be sorted out." Just then, the door to the bank opened, and in walked a man in a tailored suit. His name tag read David Reynolds, Regional Manager. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on James. The recognition was immediate, and his expression shifted from confusion to pure dread. "Mr. Carter," David said, hurrying over. "I didn't realize you were visiting today." Mike froze. His eyes darted between James and David, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. James turned to David, his expression cool and composed. "I didn't realize either, David, but it seems your staff needs a little retraining." David's face turned a shade paler. "I assure you, this isn't how we usually operate. I'll handle it personally." "Oh, you'll handle it, all right," James said, his voice rising slightly. He gestured to the crowd of onlookers. "Because I'm not the only one who's seen how your team treats people, and believe me, this is going to be a very public problem if it's not addressed immediately." David nodded quickly, turning to Mike. "You! My office! Now!" Mike stammered. Now!" David snapped, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew his own job might be on the line. Mike scurried away, leaving the counter unmanned. The other employees avoided eye contact, their faces a mix of embarrassment and fear. James watched him go, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your time, David," James said, his tone laced with finality. "We'll be talking more soon, but for now I'd like my $5,000. David nodded furiously. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Right away." As the cash was finally handed over, James took a moment to glance around the room. The customers, the staff, even David, all of them were looking at him like they'd just realized they were in the presence of someone far more powerful than they'd imagined. But James wasn't done. Not yet. James pocketed the stack of crisp bills, each one feeling like a small victory. But he wasn't here just to teach one cocky employee a lesson. This was about something much bigger. He turned to David, who still looked like he was trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. "David," James said, his voice calm but carrying a sharp edge, "I'll need a copy of the employee handbook, and while you're at it, pull up the complaint logs for this branch over the past 6 months." David's eyes widened. "Mr. Carter, Did I stutter?" James interrupted, fixing him with a look that could freeze lava. David nodded so quickly it looked like his head might fall off and scurried toward his office. The other employees were frozen in place, clearly unsure of whether to jump in or run for the hills. James ignored them and turned to the customers. The room was dead silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "Now I know what you're all thinking," James said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Who is this guy? Why is he making such a big deal over a withdrawal?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. James smirked, pausing just long enough to build the tension. "Let me answer that for you," he continued. "I'm James Carter, and I don't just bank here. I own this entire damn place." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and even a few outright laughs filled the air. One older man in the corner muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," while a younger woman pulled out her phone to record what was happening. James let the reaction wash over him, waiting until the noise died down before speaking again. "This isn't about the money," he said, his tone serious now. "This is about respect, about making sure that every single person who walks through those doors is treated fairly. Because I'm not just the CEO of this bank, I'm someone who's been where you are. Someone who's been told no one too many times just because of how I look." The crowd was silent again, hanging on his every word. Even the employees, who had been doing their best to blend into the background, were now staring at him with wide eyes. "This branch," James said, gesturing around the room, "has been failing its customers, not just today but for months, maybe years, and that stops now." Just then, David reappeared, clutching a thick binder and a stack of papers. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Here's the handbook and the logs you requested." "Thank you," James said, taking the documents without so much as a glance. He turned back to the crowd. "You see this?" he asked, holding up the binder. "This is supposed to be the rule book, but rules don't mean shit if the people enforcing them are broken." Someone in the back clapped, and soon the entire room was applauding. James raised a hand to quiet them. "Now, here's what's going to happen," he said, turning back to David. "You're going to audit this branch top to bottom. Every employee, every policy, every damn transaction, and you're going to report directly to me. Understood?" "Yes, sir," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And as for Mike," James continued, his voice dropping into an icy calm, "he's fired, effective immediately." David nodded, but James wasn't done. He turned back to the customers, his voice rising again. "If any of you have ever been mistreated in this branch, or any other branch of this bank, I want to hear about it. Today, and I promise you, it will be handled." A middle-aged woman near the front stepped forward. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't know how much this means to us." James gave her a small smile. "I do," he said simply. As the crowd began to disperse, James turned to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at the stunned employees. "One last thing," he said, his voice ringing out. "This isn't just about fixing this branch. This is about setting an example, because if I have to come back here and deal with something like this again, let's just say it won't end with a warning." With that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget the day James Carter, the CEO they didn't even recognize, walked into their bank and flipped the script.